Who are the Irish Vikings? The forgotten story of the Ustamen. When you hear Irish Vikings, you might picture horned helmet creatures that came out of someone's strange looking attic. You know, them kind of funny looking creatures you often see in some fantasy movie of some sort, who were dressed in black leather, with them dressed more like a modern motorbike gang than something out of the early medieval period. I suppose that's the image that most people like to have, a motorbike gangster in the middle of the medieval period. Seems more alpha than the actual fact, perhaps. Regardless, I'm not really here to talk about fantasy today. I want to cover the actual facts. I want to talk about the Irish Vikings. So if you're looking for motorbike gangs in the early medieval period, this isn't going to be the video for you. However, if you're like myself, you might find the truth far more fascinating than the fantasy. These settlers weren't just originally invaders. Eventually, over time, they became Irish and called themselves Ustamen. By the 10th century, they were a people who were in between the Hiberno-Scandinavian world, between the Irish world and the wider Scandinavian trading world. Let's unravel their story. The first Vikings in Ireland were Norwegian. In the Annals of Ulster, they're referred to as the Men of Luckland, and they went around the coastal areas raiding the monastic settlements. But by the mid-800s, warlords like Olaf the White and Ivor the Boneless did something pretty radical. They stayed. Ivor the Boneless, in particular, one of the most famous Vikings of all time, actually set up the Irish Viking dynasty, the Eomer. I know most Viking documentaries and the Viking television show kind of left out this really important part to Ivor the Boneless's life, but he was in fact actually the King of Dublin, and he would be the person that would give birth to one of the most famous Irish dynasties of all time, the Eomers. And the Eomers ruled Dublin for 200 years. That's a pretty long time. Marrying into Irish royalty and adopting into many Gaelic customs. This wasn't just a Viking conquest, it was a merger. Dublin became a hybrid kingdom with Norse trade and Gaelic politics. The Ustamen paid tribute to the Irish overkings and fostered children with tuat clans like the Nael, and even fought for Irish kings and against them as well. They weren't just outsiders, they were players in Ireland's Game of Thrones. By 950 AD, the Ustamen spoke both Old Norse and Old Irish. They minted coins in Jorvik, modern day north of England. Yeah, the Irish Vikings dominated the Irish Sea, and they weren't afraid to go over to England and physically take land. But that's a much more advanced story. For the time being, let's focus on the fact that they worshipped. Let's focus on the fact that in the Saxon Chronicles, they highlight the fact that they worship both the Norse and Celtic pagan gods and goddesses, and St. Patrick as well, the Irish saints. Their kings had names like Sitric Silkenbeard, a very Norse name, or MacTorkel, which is a very Gaelic name. The Dublin's assembly coexisted with also the Gaelic assemblies. They seen themselves as the sub-kings to the over-kings of Ireland. Well, when they weren't playing a part of the politics, allying themselves with one Gaelic kingdom to fight another, and at times even rebelling against the over-king himself, and sometimes not even paying their full amount of tribute to the King of Tara. These things happened, and sometimes they were even a part of massive usurpation against the Nael kingship, allying themselves to the Southern Nael to fight the likes of Niall Glundov and even usurp him. At the Battle of Isle Bridge, for example, this was one of the most bloodiest battles in Irish history, and would see the Nael help usurp the Northern Nael in favour of the Southern Nael. It's quite a big political gain. But at the same time, as I was saying earlier, they were also massively involved with the politics in England, physically moving into York and physically taking it over. They renamed it Jorvik for themselves. Archaeology has found both Thor's hammers and Celtic crosses. Even their warfare was a blend of styles, with Ustamen who used axes and shields, and adopting it with the light infantry of the Irish warbands. They were a true hybrid and very effective on the battlefield, bringing the best of both the Gaelic and Scandinavian world onto the battlefield. Dublin dominated the 10th century. Its fleet controlled the Irish Sea, trading Irish slaves for English silver and Arabic coins, slaves that they had gotten with all the fighting that was going on in Ireland between the Tuats. But politically, Dublin's kings still bowed down to the overkings like Mael Shocknall II. When they weren't paying their full tribute in the assemblies to Mael Shocknall II, it wouldn't be long until Mael Shocknall II would assemble his men in around 980 to move on to Dublin and collect his full tribute. Dublin would try to respond with the aid of Leinster, another Gaelic kingdom. However, when both armies, the army of Leinster and Dublin, met against the men of Meath, the men of Ireland, they were completely wiped out and obliterated by the overking Mael Shocknall II. And it wasn't long until Dublin would be sieged and captured, putting it back into the fold, and Mael Shocknall II would collect all of his tribute from Dublin. Even 40 years later, Brian Boru himself would march on Dublin in 1014 to enforce his power onto the men of Dublin, just like he was doing with the rest of Ireland. Places like the Northern Inel, way up in Armagh, where he announced that he was Emperor of the Gael, and even in Leinster, where he wrecked up and took all the cattle he could. Dublin was no different. But what's very interesting is that by the time we get to 1014, and you're dealing with Sitric Silkenbeard, his two ancestors were both of the Northern Inel, Southern Inel, and on his mother's side, he was related to the kings of Leinster. Even Brian Boru himself. Also, on top of that, Sitric Silkenbeard was the stepson to Brian Boru, both through the marriage with his mother after the death of his father to Brian Boru, and the fact that Sitric Silkenbeard had also married the daughter of Brian Boru. That's how closely connected the men of Dublin were by the time we get to 1014 with the rest of Ireland. And as one can imagine, the Battle of Clontarf wasn't Irish versus Vikings. It was a messy civil war. Brian's army was made up of both Ustamen, Irish Vikings, and Gaelic. His military force was also made up of men from Iceland, Norway, Denmark, all through England, and even Scotland. Brian Boru's force was quite large, and so were the men of Dublin, with mercenaries coming from pretty much all over the Western world to meet up to fight at the Battle of Clontarf. It was a massive battle, but I'd have to go into a complete separate video to discuss that one. In England, the Irish Vikings were expelled as foreigners. In Ireland, they melted into society. Why were these Vikings able to adapt into Irish society? That was through fosterage, hostage, and marriages. Ustamen kings raised their kids in Irish court, in Irish halls, and vice versa. It wouldn't be strange to see too many Gaelic children running around the great halls of Dublin. By 1100 AD, surnames like MacLachlan, son of the Norsemen, led Irish dynasties. Meanwhile, Dublin's Ustamen still called themselves Eastmen, but ruled as Gaelic chieftains. Even after the Normans arrived in Ireland in 1169, Dublin's Ustamen negotiated rights as civilians, descendants of both the Irish and Norse world. Their legacy can still be seen today in both Dublin, Waterford and Wexford, and this is backed by DNA studies, showing at least 1 in 5 Irish people still have Viking roots today. The Ustamen weren't just temporary invaders, they were Ireland's first urbanizers. They gave us words like market, boat, and they were a hybrid of cultures that shaped Ireland's political, art and identity. So what's next? So next time somebody refers to the Norsemen as Viking foreigners, just remember about the Irish Vikings, the Ustamen, and you'll suddenly notice how complicated this topic actually really is. If you enjoyed this dive into Ireland's Norse-Gaelic past, hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Was Sitric Silkenbeard a Viking or an Irish king? Let's debate and have an old conversation about that. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed today's video. And of course, if you like Irish Vikings, I'm actually doing a good few classes on them on my Patreon, all the way up to the 5th of July. So definitely head on to my Patreon and join up. It's only 20 quid a month, which isn't too bad given how much you're going to be given. Once a week on Sunday nights, I do live stream classes, and if you miss them, I always do recordings as well, so you can always catch up. Other than that, guys, thanks very much, and slán go.